In 1912, deep in the misty hills of the Missouri Ozarks, a young schoolteacher named Eliza Whitlock vanishes while traveling between towns. Locals whisper about a reclusive family living high in the ridges, unseen for decades. When investigators finally search the area, they uncover a nightmare, evidence of cannibalism, missing travelers, and Eliza's desperate fight for survival. Her story becomes a chilling legend of isolation, horror, and one woman's will to escape the hills alive. The morning mist clung to the hollows like secrets refusing to surface, and somewhere in those ancient ridges, something far worse than wild animals stalked human prey. What Eliza discovered in that hidden cabin would haunt the Ozarks for generations, but the question that still echoes through these hills is simple and terrifying. Did she really escape, or did something wearing her face walk out of those woods? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather satchel sat carefully positioned beside Eliza Whitlock's narrow bed, its worn brass buckles catching the first light of dawn through her boarding house window. Inside lay her most precious possessions, a primer on arithmetic, carefully transcribed lessons in penmanship, and letters from her sister Margaret back in St. Louis. At 24, Eliza possessed a determination that set her apart from other young ladies of her generation, most of whom concerned themselves with finding suitable husbands rather than bringing education to the remote corners of Missouri. The Missouri Ozarks in 1912 remained a land caught between centuries. While cities like Kansas City and St. Louis embraced electric lights and automobile traffic, these ancient hills held fast to older ways. Families lived in hollows their great-grandfathers had claimed, suspicious of outsiders and content with isolation that bred peculiar customs. The ridges and valleys created natural barriers that kept communities separate, sometimes for generations. Cedar Ridge, where Eliza had spent the past 6 months, exemplified this isolation. The town consisted of perhaps 40 souls clustered around a general store, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse, and a handful of weathered cabins. The nearest railroad stop lay 30 miles southeast, connected only by wagon roads that became treacherous streams. During heavy rains, Eliza had arrived in Cedar Ridge with letters of introduction from the Missouri Department of Education and a fierce conviction that every child deserved to read and write, regardless of how remote their circumstances. The local families had received her with polite skepticism. Education seemed less important than learning to tend crops, hunt game, and preserve food for harsh winters. Yet gradually, she had won them over. Her patience with slow learners, her willingness to adapt lessons to local needs, and her genuine respect for mountain traditions had earned grudging acceptance. When young Timothy Fletcher began reading Bible verses aloud at Sunday service, his parents credited Miss Whitlock's persistence. When Sarah Mae Hutchins solved arithmetic problems faster than her older brothers, folks admitted that perhaps book learning had its place. The children adored her. Eliza possessed a gift for making letters and numbers come alive through stories and games. She taught geography by relating tales of distant cities, history through accounts of brave pioneers, and science by examining the natural world around them. Her students progressed rapidly under her patient guidance, but Cedar Ridge was only the beginning. Word had spread through the mountain communities about the young teacher who achieved remarkable results. A letter had arrived 3 weeks ago from Millerville, a settlement deeper in the hills, requesting her services. The town council offered generous compensation and promised suitable lodging for a teacher willing to establish their first proper school. Eliza's landlady, Mrs. Patterson, had tried to dissuade her from accepting. "Millerville's a far piece into the high country," she warned, while mending torn curtains by lamplight. "Roads treacherous even in good weather, and winters coming fast. Sensible folks don't venture that direction without good reason. Other locals shared similar concerns, though their warnings carried undertones Eliza couldn't quite decipher. References to strange doings in the high ridges, families who kept to themselves in unnatural ways, and advice to stick to the traveled roads suggested fears beyond mere geographical inconvenience. Old Ezra Henderson, who ran the general store, had been most explicit. "Miss Whitlock, you've done fine work here, but some places ain't meant for civilized folks. There's families up in them ridges that ain't seen town in decades. They got their own ways, and them ways ain't Christian." When pressed for specifics, Ezra had grown evasive. "Just stories, mostly. Travelers gone missing. Strange sounds at night, smoke rising from places where no honest homestead ought to be. Probably just mountain talk, but why take chances?" Despite these warnings, Eliza felt called to serve where she was most needed. Millerville's children deserved the same opportunities she had provided in Cedar Ridge. Her faith and determination had carried her through challenges before. They would sustain her through whatever difficulties lay ahead. The morning of her departure, several Cedar Ridge families gathered to see her off. She had arranged to travel with Josiah Miller, who made regular supply runs between settlements. His wagon would carry her belongings as far as Miller's Fork, where Millerville's representative would meet them for the final stretch into the high country. Eliza secured her satchel carefully in Miller's wagon, ensuring her teaching materials remained protected during the journey ahead. The leather case represented everything she valued: knowledge, purpose, and connection to the larger world beyond these isolated hills. Whatever challenges awaited in Millerville, she would face them armed with education's transformative power. The hand-drawn map crinkled in Josiah Miller's weathered fingers as he traced the route with obvious reluctance. Crude pencil markings showed the main wagon road stretching east toward Miller's Fork, but someone had scratched harsh X's across several mountain paths leading north into the high ridges. Red ink, faded with age, marked warnings beside certain areas: "No good, stay clear," and most ominously, "They watch." "This here map's been passed down through 3 generations of my family," Josiah explained, his voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. "My granddaddy marked them danger spots after losing 2 cousins who went exploring where they shouldn't have. Some places in these hills ain't meant for decent folk." Eliza studied the markings while their wagon creaked along the rutted road. Morning mist still clung to the valleys below, but the autumn sun was beginning to burn through, revealing the spectacular colors of maple and oak that painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds. The beauty of the landscape made the map's ominous warnings seem almost absurd. "Surely these marks refer to dangerous terrain," she reasoned. "Steep cliffs, unstable ground, areas prone to rock slides during storms." Josiah shook his graying head. "No, ma'am. My granddaddy knew every inch of dangerous ground in these parts. These marks point to something else entirely. Places where smoke rises but no decent homestead shows, where game trails end sudden-like, where even the animals won't venture." Their wagon continued eastward, following a path that had been carved by generations of travelers seeking passage through the maze of ridges and hollows. The road itself told stories: deep ruts from countless wheels, stumps of massive trees cleared decades ago, stone markers placed by early settlers to guide future travelers safely through the wilderness. As they climbed higher into the mountains, signs of human habitation became increasingly sparse. Occasional abandoned cabins dotted the landscape, their roofs collapsed and walls reclaimed by climbing vines. Eliza noticed that many of these ruins bore scorch marks, as if they had been deliberately burned rather than simply allowed to decay. "What happened to all these homesteads?" she asked, gesturing toward a particularly large ruin that must once have housed an entire family. "Folks moved on," Josiah replied curtly, but his eyes avoided the burned remains. "Sometimes the mountain life don't agree with people. Sometimes people don't agree with each other." Near midday, they encountered their first sign of current human presence, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere deep in a wooded hollow to their north. The smoke was too thick and consistent to be a simple cooking fire, suggesting a larger operation of some kind. Josiah noticed Eliza's interest and quickly snapped his whip to urge their horses faster. "Don't go looking toward that smoke, Miss Whitlock. Some curiosity ain't healthy in these parts. Surely it's just another family making their living in the mountains," Eliza protested. "Perhaps they have children who could benefit from education." "That smoke's been rising from that hollow for near 20 years, Josiah said grimly. "Ain't no family making an honest living produces that much smoke, that regular, for that long. And ain't no children up there that any Christian woman would want to encounter." The road began to wind more treacherously as they climbed toward Miller's Fork. Ancient oaks pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade, and Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was in this dim tunnel of trees that they discovered the first truly disturbing sign. Hanging from a low branch, just at eye level for anyone traveling the road, was a collection of small bones tied together with sinew. The arrangement was clearly deliberate, not the random remains of some animal's meal, but a careful construction meant to be seen and interpreted. Josiah pulled the wagon to an immediate halt, his face draining of color. "Dear Lord," he whispered, making the sign of the cross. "They're marking territory now." Eliza examined the bone arrangement more closely, her teacher's analytical mind attempting to make sense of what she saw. The bones appeared to be from small animals, rabbits, squirrels, perhaps a young deer. But their arrangement suggested human intelligence behind their placement, and the sinew that bound them had been worked with considerable skill. "Who would create such a thing?" she asked. "Folks that ain't quite folks anymore," Josiah replied, already turning the wagon around. "Miss Whitlock, we're heading back to Cedar Ridge right now. Millerville can find themselves another teacher." But Eliza's determination had only strengthened. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate your concern, but I've committed to serve these people. A few primitive decorations won't deter me from my duty." Josiah stared at her, as if she had announced her intention to walk into a raging fire. "Miss, you don't understand what you're seeing here. This ain't decoration. This here's a warning." The torn fabric fluttered against the thorny blackberry bush like a small flag of surrender. Eliza dismounted from her mare to examine it more closely, her heart sinking as she recognized the delicate floral pattern typical of a young girl's Sunday dress. The cotton was of good quality, recently torn, with dark stains that could have been mud, but appeared disturbingly rust-colored in the fading afternoon light. Josiah had departed Miller's Fork that morning, despite Eliza's protests, leaving her in the care of a silent mountain man named Caleb, who claimed to represent Millerville's town council. Something about Caleb troubled her deeply, his unwashed appearance, the way his eyes never quite met hers directly, and his reluctance to answer even simple questions about the settlement she had come to serve. Her horse, a gentle chestnut mare named Belle, had carried Eliza faithfully through 3 hours of increasingly treacherous mountain paths. But as they climbed higher into the ridges, Belle's behavior had grown increasingly agitated. The mare's ears constantly swiveled, alert to sounds that Eliza couldn't detect, and several times Belle had shied violently at seemingly empty spaces along the trail. Now, examining the torn fabric, Eliza understood her horse's unease. This was not the dress of some mountain child who had simply caught her clothing on thorns during play. The fabric was too fresh, the tears too violent, and the stains too ominous. Someone had struggled here, fought against restraint, and lost. "Miss Whitlock," Caleb called from ahead, his voice carrying an undertone of impatience. "We need to keep moving, if we're to reach Millerville before dark." Eliza carefully removed the fabric from the thorns and tucked it into her coat pocket. Evidence should be preserved, she reasoned, though she wasn't certain what authority might exist in these remote hills to investigate whatever had occurred here. As they continued climbing, more disturbing signs appeared along the trail, scratches in tree bark that looked suspiciously like desperate fingernail marks. A child's wooden toy, hand-carved but abandoned in the middle of the path, as if dropped during flight. Most unsettling, a series of what appeared to be deliberate markers, stacks of stones, bundles of sticks bound with grass, arrangements that suggested human intelligence but served no obvious purpose. "Mr. Caleb," Eliza called, "these markers along the trail, do they indicate distances to Millerville?" Caleb glanced back briefly, his eyes touching the stone stack she indicated before quickly looking away. "Old Indian signs," he muttered. "Don't mean nothing to civilized folks," but Eliza had studied local Indian cultures during her teacher training, and these markers bore no resemblance to any tribal communication system she recognized. They seemed more recent, cruder, as if created by someone attempting to copy Indian practices without understanding their meaning. The trail began to narrow dramatically as they approached what Caleb claimed was the final ridge before descending to Millerville. The path barely accommodated a single horse, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. Belle's nervousness increased dramatically in these confined spaces, and Eliza found herself constantly stroking the mare's neck to maintain calm. It was here, in the narrowest section of the trail, that they encountered the most disturbing evidence yet. Scattered across the path were personal belongings that told a story of violence and terror. A man's pocket watch, its chain broken as if torn away by force. A woman's hair ribbon trampled into the dirt. Most chillingly, a small leather shoe that would have fit a child of perhaps 10 years. Eliza dismounted to examine these items more carefully, her teacher's instincts demanding that she document what she was seeing. Each item suggested not just robbery, but something far more sinister. The belongings were scattered randomly, as if their owners had been seized suddenly and dragged away without regard for what they dropped. "These people," she said, holding up the child's shoe, "what happened to them?" Caleb's expression darkened, and for the first time since leaving Miller's Fork, he looked directly at her. His eyes held a strange mixture of hunger and calculation that made her stomach tighten with instinctive fear. "Accidents happen in the mountains, Miss Whitlock," he said slowly. "People lose their footing, fall down ravines, get lost in storms. Wild animals got to eat too." The way he spoke these words, with a peculiar emphasis on wild animals, sent ice through Eliza's veins. She began to understand that her guide might not be leading her to safety, but deeper into danger with each step they took. Belle suddenly reared, nearly throwing Eliza from the saddle. The mare's eyes rolled white with terror, and no amount of soothing could calm her panic. Something in the rocks above them had moved, something that triggered every prey instinct the horse possessed. Looking up, Eliza caught a glimpse of a human figure ducking behind an outcropping, but it moved with a peculiar, predatory quality that suggested this was no ordinary mountain dweller. Whatever was watching them from the rocks above possessed an awareness and purpose that filled her with dread. The bone fishhook necklace caught the dying sunlight as it swayed against the chest of the creature that had once been a man. Strung on sinew darkened with age and use, the hooks had been carved from what Eliza realized with growing horror were human finger bones, each one polished smooth by constant handling. The man wearing this grotesque ornament smiled at her, with teeth filed to sharp points, his eyes holding the same predatory gleam she had glimpsed in the rocks above. "Welcome to our home, Miss Teacher," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who rarely spoke to outsiders. "I am Jeremiah, patriarch of this family. My son Caleb has brought us a fine gift." Eliza's mare had finally thrown her during the ambush that followed their descent from the narrow trail. 3 figures had emerged from concealment with movements that seemed barely human, too fluid, too quick, like wolves accustomed to coordinated hunting. Belle had fled immediately, leaving Eliza surrounded by beings that wore human form but had abandoned human nature entirely. The patriarch stood perhaps 6 feet tall, but his posture was stooped from years of moving through low caves and dense undergrowth. His hair hung in matted ropes to his shoulders, adorned with small bones and what appeared to be dried human scalp. Most disturbing were his hands. The fingernails had grown into claw-like talons, and his palms bore ritual scars that formed deliberate patterns. "Father," Caleb said, his earlier pretense of civilization completely abandoned. "She saw the trail markers. Knows we've been taking travelers? Course she does, boy. Ain't stupid, this one." Can see the knowing in her eyes. Jeremiah circled Eliza slowly, his movements predatory and calculating. "Question is, what we gonna do with someone who knows our business?" The third figure remained silent, but equally terrifying. Younger than Caleb but larger, with massive shoulders and arms that suggested he served as the family's primary hunter. His clothing was fashioned entirely from human skin, crudely tanned and stitched together with sinew. Most horrifying, he wore a necklace of human teeth. Not pulled teeth, but entire jaw sections strung together like some nightmare version of a warrior's trophy collection. "This is Moses," Jeremiah said, noticing Eliza's horrified stare. "My youngest boy. Don't talk much since we took his tongue for lying, but he's real good at other things. Real good at making folks ready for the pot." Eliza's mind reeled as the full implications of her situation became clear. These were not simply primitive mountain dwellers or even common criminals. They were something far worse, a family that had crossed the ultimate boundary of human behavior and embraced cannibalism as their way of life. "You're planning to eat me," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. Jeremiah laughed, a sound like grinding bone. "Smart girl. Most folks we take don't figure it out till they see the cookpot. But you got education, don't you? Can read and write and cipher numbers?" "Yes. I'm a teacher. I came here to establish a school for the children of Millerville." "Ain't no Millerville," Caleb said with cruel amusement. "Ain't been no settlement up this way for near 20 years. We've been using that story to bring folks up here nice and willing-like." The patriarch nodded approvingly. "Smart boy, my Caleb. Figured out that folks come easier when they think they're doing good works. Teachers, preachers, government men. They all got that need to help others. Makes them easy to catch." Eliza realized that her teaching certificate, her letters of introduction, her entire mission had been based on elaborate deception. There were no children waiting for education, no grateful community eager for her services. She had walked willingly into a trap that had claimed dozens of victims before her. How long? Whom, she asked, fighting to maintain composure while her mind raced for any possible escape. "How long have you been doing this?" "Started during the war," Jeremiah said, his eyes taking on a distant quality. "Food got scarce, real scarce. Lost the corn crop to drought, hunting got poor. Had to choose between starving and surviving. Once you cross that line, ain't no going back." Moses grunted and pointed toward the setting sun, apparently concerned about remaining daylight. "Boy's right," Jeremiah agreed. "Need to get you settled before dark. Got preparations to make, rituals to observe. Can't just go eating folks without proper ceremony. Got to show respect for the meat we're given." As they forced her toward what she could now see was not a homestead, but a collection of caves and crude shelters built into the rocky mountainside. Eliza glimpsed evidence of their long history of murder. Piles of belongings sorted by type. Shoes in one stack, clothing in another, jewelry and watches in carefully arranged collections. The organization suggested this was not random violence, but a systematic operation that had been perfected over years of practice. The bone fishhook necklace swayed hypnotically as Jeremiah walked ahead of her, each hook representing not just a tool but a trophy, a reminder of some victim who had provided both sustenance and material for their grotesque crafts. The collection of personal effects was arranged with disturbing care across makeshift shelves carved into the cave walls. Pocket watches ticked in different rhythms, creating a cacophony of time that seemed to mock the final moments of their former owners. Wedding rings were sorted by metal type, gold in one wooden bowl, silver in another, with cheaper bands relegated to a rusty tin can. Most chilling were the photographs, dozens of them, showing smiling families who had posed for what they believed would be cherished memories. Eliza sat bound in the main chamber of what the family called their home, and though it bore no resemblance to any dwelling she had ever seen, The cave system extended deep into the mountainside, with passages leading to chambers she could only glimpse in the flickering firelight. The smell that permeated everything was indescribable, a mixture of decay, smoke, and something sweetly rotten that made her stomach churn continuously. Jeremiah moved through his domain with obvious pride, occasionally picking up items from his collection to examine them fondly. "This here watch belonged to a railroad man from Springfield," he said, holding up a silver timepiece. "Fought real hard, that one did. Took 3 of us to bring him down. But he made fine eating, tough but flavorful. The casual way he discussed murder and cannibalism while handling the victim's possessions demonstrated how completely the family had abandoned human morality. These were not desperate people driven to extremes by circumstances. They had embraced evil and made it their identity. Moses emerged from one of the deeper chambers carrying what appeared to be a freshly butchered haunch of meat. The size and shape of the joint left no doubt about its origin, and Eliza fought back waves of nausea as she realized she was witnessing preparation for a meal that would include human flesh. "That's from the last teacher we caught," Jeremiah explained matter-of-factly. "Young fellow from Kansas City, thought he could bring civilization to the mountains. Learned different, he did. Been feeding on him for near 2 weeks now." Caleb worked near the cave mouth, maintaining a fire that served multiple purposes: cooking, warmth, and what Eliza realized was a signal to other family members scattered throughout the ridge system. The smoke pattern seemed deliberate, rising in specific intervals that suggested a primitive but effective communication method. "How many are there?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Family's grown considerable over the years," Jeremiah said with pride. "Started with just me and my wife Sarah, God rest her gnawed bones. Added Caleb when we found him abandoned as a baby. Then Moses when his real parents couldn't feed him proper. Got 3 more boys scattered through the ridges, hunting and watching the trails." The patriarch settled himself on a chair constructed entirely from human bones, the skull that formed the seat back still bearing traces of hair and scalp. The craftsmanship was crude but effective, and the chair creaked ominously under his weight. "See, most folks think we're just crazy mountain people," he continued, warming to his subject. "But we got organization, we got purpose. Been perfecting our methods for near 20 years now. Know which trails travelers use, what stories bring them up here willing-like, how to preserve meat through the winter months." Eliza noticed movement in the shadows beyond the firelight, other figures that remained just out of clear sight but watched her with obvious interest. The family was larger than just the 3 she had met, and she sensed that her capture was providing entertainment for the entire clan. "The children," she said, remembering the torn dress fabric. "You take children too?" Jeremiah's expression darkened. "Children's tend to cook up real nice, but they serve other purposes too. Young ones can be trained, taught our ways, made into proper family members. Of course, most don't take to the training. Most end up in the pot after all." Near the collection of personal effects, Eliza spotted something that made her heart race. A leather-bound journal that she recognized as a teacher's grade book. The pages were stained and partially burned, but she could make out entries in careful handwriting that documented student progress and attendance records. "That belonged to the fellow Moses is preparing for supper," Jeremiah noticed her interest. "Kept detailed records, he did. Real organized mind. We've been using his book to practice our letters, though most of the boys ain't much for learning." The casual desecration of another educator's lifework struck Eliza as profoundly evil. That journal represented someone's dedication to nurturing young minds, their hope for the future, their belief in human potential. Now it served as entertainment for creatures who had chosen to feast on humanity rather than elevate it. From deeper in the cave system came sounds that defied interpretation. Scraping, rhythmic pounding, and what might have been human voices raised in some primitive chant. Whatever rituals the family practiced extended beyond simple cannibalism into realms of depravity that challenged her ability to comprehend. The makeshift diary grew page by page, written in charcoal on scraps of paper torn from the murdered teacher's gradebook. Eliza wrote in tiny script during the brief moments when her captors dozed or ventured into the deeper cave passages, documenting everything she observed about their routines, their weaknesses, and their family dynamics. Each entry was hidden carefully within the pages of her own prayer book, which they had allowed her to keep as a cruel joke. "Day 3 in hell," she wrote by the fading firelight. Jeremiah sleeps deeply after his evening meal. Moses returns before dawn each day with fresh wood and water from a spring somewhere above. Caleb watches me constantly, but grows careless when discussing their hunting methods. They believe I am broken by fear, but I am learning. The family's routine had become predictable over her first week of captivity. Jeremiah maintained absolute authority through a combination of physical dominance and religious delusion. He claimed that God had chosen their family to serve as instruments of divine judgment, purifying the world by consuming the flesh of the unworthy. His twisted theology provided justification for every act of murder and cannibalism. Moses served as the primary hunter and gatherer, his massive frame allowing him to carry enormous loads of firewood and fresh water from mountain springs. Despite his mutilated tongue, he communicated effectively through hand signals and grunts that the other family members understood perfectly. Eliza noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with certain aspects of their lifestyle, particularly when Jeremiah discussed their treatment of children. Caleb had assumed responsibility for maintaining their deception operation, traveling periodically to towns throughout the region to spread stories about remote settlements in need of teachers, preachers, or government assistance. His ability to present himself as a respectable mountain guide had made him invaluable to their hunting strategy, but it was the family's treatment of her that revealed their most significant weakness: overconfidence. Born from decades of unopposed success, they had grown careless because no victim had ever escaped to warn others. No outside authority had ever investigated their activities, and no resistance had ever threatened their dominance of the high ridges. Eliza began to test the boundaries of their vigilance through small acts of defiance. She deliberately spilled water while being forced to clean cooking vessels, requiring additional trips to replenish their supply. She pretended to stumble frequently while moving around the cave, forcing them to assist her and revealing more about the layout of their underground domain. Most importantly, she began engaging them in conversation whenever possible, drawing them out about their history and methods while carefully observing their personalities and motivations. Jeremiah enjoyed discussing his twisted philosophy and could be encouraged to talk for hours about his interpretation of biblical passages that supposedly supported cannibalism. "God gave us dominion over all creatures," he explained. During one such session, his eyes gleaming with fanatic fervor, "That includes the two-legged beasts that think they're better than us. We're just exercising our divine right to feed on the inferior species." Through these conversations, Eliza learned that the family's isolation had begun as a choice, but had become a necessity after their first acts of cannibalism. They could never return to normal society because their crimes would be immediately apparent to anyone who observed their behavior and appearance closely. She also discovered that they had established cache sites throughout the ridge system, hidden stores of weapons, tools, and preserved food that would allow them to survive even if their main cave was discovered. This network of supply points meant that simply escaping from their immediate stronghold would not guarantee safety. The most valuable intelligence came from observing their emotional dynamics. Jeremiah ruled through fear and religious manipulation, but his sons occasionally showed signs of independent thought that he quickly suppressed. Moses seemed particularly conflicted about their lifestyle, and Eliza sensed that his loyalty was based more on dependence than genuine belief in his father's philosophy. During her 5th night of captivity, While pretending to sleep, Eliza overheard a conversation between Caleb and Moses that revealed crucial information about their hunting schedule. 3 more family members were expected to return within days, bringing additional captives taken from travelers along different mountain routes. "Feast time coming soon," Caleb whispered to his mute brother. "Father wants the teacher kept fresh until then. Says her meat will be sweeter if she's properly fattened and seasoned with fear." Moses grunted, what sounded like agreement, but Eliza detected reluctance in his response. The giant man glanced toward where she lay bound, and she sensed that he might be the key to her survival if she could find a way to exploit his apparent discomfort with their family's practices. Her makeshift diary grew longer each night, becoming not just a record of her observations, but a testament to her determination to survive. If she somehow escaped this nightmare, the world needed to know about the evil that thrived in these isolated mountains. The family Bible lay open on a flat stone that served as Jeremiah's lectern, its pages filled with handwritten annotations in faded ink that twisted scripture into justification for unspeakable acts. Eliza could read portions of the text from where she sat bound, and what she saw chilled her more than the October mountain air that seeped through cracks in the cave walls. In the margins beside Leviticus, someone had written, "The Lord provides all manner of flesh for sustenance. Those who refuse his bounty shall themselves become bounty for the faithful." Next to Genesis chapters detailing God's covenant with Abraham, crude handwriting declared, "As Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, so must we consume the children of the unworthy to please the Almighty." "My grandfather started these holy annotations," Jeremiah explained during one of his increasingly frequent sermons. Ezekiel Hutchins was his name, and he received divine visions during the war between the states. Showed him how the Lord intended for his chosen people to survive when the world ended in fire and blood. The patriarch's voice carried the fervor of someone who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. He had inherited not just his grandfather's twisted interpretations of Scripture, but also the man's conviction that their family had been selected by God for a special purpose that transcended normal human morality. Ezekiel was a preacher before the visions came, Jeremiah continued, running his scarred fingers along the Bible's worn pages. Had himself a proper church down in the valley, congregation of maybe 50 souls. But when the war started, when folks began dying faster than they could be buried, he understood that the end times had begun. According to family legend, the first act of cannibalism had occurred during the harsh winter of 1863, when Ezekiel's isolated congregation faced starvation. Rather than abandon their mountain sanctuary, the preacher had declared that God would provide sustenance through unconventional means. The first victim had been a wounded Union soldier who had sought shelter with the religious community. Granddaddy said the soldier's flesh was sweet as honey, Jeremiah recounted with obvious relish. Said it was like communion but better, taking the body and blood of Christ's enemies into ourselves, making us stronger and more holy with every bite. From that first transgression, the practice had expanded and evolved. Ezekiel's congregation had gradually abandoned any pretense of normal worship, transforming into a cult that viewed cannibalism as a sacrament. When the war ended and outside authorities began investigating reports of missing travelers, the group had retreated deeper into the mountains and adopted their current lifestyle of complete isolation. The women all died out eventually, Jeremiah explained with casual brutality. Some couldn't stomach the holy work we were called to do. Others got too old to bear children and weren't worth feeding anymore. But the men, we adapted. We learned to find new family members wherever God provided. To them, Eliza realized that the 3 sons were not Jeremiah's biological children, but rather captives, who had been indoctrinated into the family's practices. Moses and Caleb had probably been taken as young children and raised to believe that cannibalism was not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. The Bible's annotations grew more elaborate and disturbing as they progressed through the Old Testament. Passages about animal sacrifice had been reinterpreted to justify human sacrifice. Stories of God's wrath against the wicked had been twisted into permission to murder and consume anyone the family deemed unworthy. Most chilling were the detailed records, kept in the Bible's back pages, lists of victims with dates, descriptions, and notes about the quality of their flesh. The entries stretched back nearly 50 years, documenting hundreds of murders committed in the name of twisted religious conviction. "Here's the railroad man I told you about," Jeremiah said, pointing to an entry dated 2 months earlier. October 15th, 1912, Samuel Morrison, age 34, from Springfield. "Tough meat but good quantity. Lusted the family near 3 weeks with proper rationing." Below that entry in fresher ink was another notation. October 20th, 1912, William Henderson, schoolteacher, age 26, from Kansas City. "Tender flesh, educated blood. Provided excellent meat for the harvest feast." Eliza's blood ran cold as she realized they had already selected a date for her own death. November 1st, marked in the margin as All Saints' Day feast. New teacher to be prepared for holy consumption. Female flesh for the glory of God. The family's religious delusions had created a complete moral framework that not only justified their crimes, but made them feel righteous about committing them. They weren't simply criminals or madmen. They were believers whose faith had been corrupted into something infinitely more dangerous than mere evil. Understanding their twisted theology gave Eliza insight into how they might be manipulated. But it also revealed the futility of appealing to their humanity. These were people who had convinced themselves that murder and cannibalism were acts of worship, that their victims were offerings to God, and that their own survival depended on continuing these practices indefinitely. The hidden cache of supplies lay concealed beneath a loose stone slab in the deepest recess of the cave system. Discovered by accident when Eliza stumbled during one of her carefully orchestrated falls. Her bound hands had struck the stone just so, revealing the hollow space beneath and the glint of metal within. A previous victim had managed to hide weapons and provisions here, evidence that she was not the first to resist the family's evil. Inside the cache, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture, were items that spoke of desperate preparation and failed escape attempts. A small hunting knife with a bone handle, its blade still sharp despite years of concealment. Several strips of dried venison that would remain edible indefinitely if kept dry. Most importantly, a coil of thin rope that could serve multiple purposes in an escape attempt. But it was the other occupant of the cave who offered Eliza the most hope. Ruth emerged from the shadows during Eliza's second week of captivity, moving with the furtive caution of someone who had learned to survive through invisibility. She appeared to be perhaps 20 years old, though malnutrition and constant fear had aged her beyond her years. "Don't let them see you notice me," Ruth whispered during a moment when the men were occupied with butchering their latest victim. "They think I'm simple, that I don't understand what they do. It's the only reason they keep me alive." Ruth was Jeremiah's daughter, the sole surviving female member of the family, and a living reminder of what prolonged exposure to their evil could produce. Her mother had been the last woman captured and forced into the family structure, and Ruth represented the product of that violent union. "My mother tried to escape when I was small," Ruth continued in barely audible tones. "They caught her at Miller's Fork and brought her back, made me watch while they punished her for running. After that, she never spoke again, just sat in the corner rocking until she died." Unlike her male relatives, Ruth retained enough humanity to recognize the evil surrounding her. She had survived by pretending to be mentally deficient, allowing the men to believe she posed no threat while secretly maintaining her sanity through small acts of resistance and hope. "I've been waiting for someone like you," she told Eliza. "Someone strong enough and smart enough to get away from here." I know all their secrets, all their hiding places, all their weaknesses. Ruth revealed that the family's isolation was not as complete as they pretended. They maintained contact with other degenerate clans scattered throughout the Ozark mountain region, trading information about potential victims and sharing techniques for avoiding detection by outside authorities. There's a gathering every few years, she explained. Families come from all over the mountains to trade stories and other things. They're planning one for next month, which means most of the men will be away for several days. More immediately useful was Ruth's knowledge of the cave system's layout. The tunnels extended much farther than Eliza had realized, connecting to natural springs, hidden exits, and storage chambers that the family used to maintain their operations. Ruth had explored these passages during her childhood before she learned to fear her own relatives. "There's a way out through the water caves," Ruth whispered. "Leads to a spring that comes out near the main trail, maybe 2 miles from here. But you have to know exactly which passages to follow, or you'll get lost forever in the dark." Ruth also possessed crucial information about the family's hunting patterns and communication methods. The smoke signals Eliza had observed were part of an elaborate system that allowed scattered family members to coordinate their activities across dozens of square miles of mountain territory. They used different smoke patterns to mean different things, Ruth explained. 3 short puffs means travelers on the south trail. Long steady smoke means danger from outside. No smoke at all means it's safe to move around freely. Most importantly, Ruth revealed that she possessed the key to Eliza's bonds, a small metal tool hidden in her clothing that could unlock the crude shackles the family used to restrain their captives. "I've been planning this for years," she said, her eyes showing the first spark of hope Eliza had seen there. "Waiting for the right person, the right moment. You're educated, you know the outside world. If we can get you away from here, you can bring help." The 2 women began to plan in earnest, using Ruth's intimate knowledge of the family's routines and Eliza's analytical skills to develop a strategy that might actually succeed. They would have only one chance. If they failed, Ruth's deception would be discovered, and both women would face fates worse than simple death. "Promise me something," Ruth said as they concluded their first planning session. "If you make it out and I don't, promise you'll tell the world what happened here. Make sure people know that some of us never stopped being human, even in this place." The bloodied rock lay where it had fallen after striking Caleb's skull, its granite surface stained dark with evidence of Eliza's transformation from passive victim to desperate fighter. She had found the stone in the hidden cache along with the other supplies, and it had seemed like salvation, a weapon that could provide the force needed to overcome her captors. But the escape attempt had failed catastrophically, teaching her brutal lessons about the family's true nature when threatened. It had begun perfectly according to their plan. Ruth had created a distraction by accidentally spilling the evening stew, causing Jeremiah to rage while Moses scrambled to salvage their meal. In the confusion, Eliza had used Ruth's hidden key to unlock her bonds and retrieve the weapons from the cache. The stone felt solid and reassuring in her grip as she crept toward the cave entrance. Caleb had been positioned as the night guard, but Ruth's intelligence about his habits suggested he would be drowsing by the fire rather than maintaining vigilant watch. Eliza approached from his blind side, raising the rock with both hands to deliver what should have been a knockout blow. The stone connected with his skull with a sickening crack that echoed through the cave chamber, but Caleb possessed the hardy constitution of someone raised in brutal circumstances. Instead of falling unconscious, he rolled away from the blow and began screaming for his father and brother. Within seconds, the entire family was awake and converging on Eliza's position. Moses reached her first, his massive hands closing around her throat with crushing force. Despite his mutilated tongue, he roared with animal fury as he lifted her off the ground. Only Jeremiah's intervention saved her life, the patriarch shouting orders that penetrated Moses' rage. "Don't kill her yet, boy. She's got lessons to learn first." What followed was a demonstration of cruelty that revealed how the family maintained control over their victims and each other. They dragged Eliza to a chamber she had never seen before, carved deep into the mountain and fitted with iron rings set into the stone walls. The smell of old blood and human waste made it clear that this was where they conducted their most brutal activities. Jeremiah supervised, while his sons chained Eliza spread-eagled against the wall, her arms and legs stretched to their limits. The patriarch then selected tools from a collection that represented decades of refinement in the art of causing pain without causing death. "You see, Miss Teacher," he said conversationally while heating an iron rod in the chamber's fire, "we've learned that breaking folks properly requires patience. Kill them too quick, and they never really understand their place in God's plan." The hot iron touched her shoulder with a hiss that was drowned out by her own screams. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but worse was the realization that this was only the beginning. Jeremiah worked with the methodical precision of someone who had perfected his techniques through countless repetitions. "My granddaddy taught me that proper seasoning requires both salt and suffering," he continued, selecting a different tool. "Flesh tastes better when it's been properly prepared with fear and pain. Makes the meat more tender, more flavorful." Between applications of various tortures, Jeremiah forced her to watch as they punished Ruth for her role in the escape attempt. The young woman's screams echoed through the chamber as Moses held her while Caleb carved symbols into her arms with a rusted knife. "She's been playing us for fools," Jeremiah said as he watched his daughter's torment, "pretending to be simple while planning betrayal. That's what happens when we show mercy to the weak." The session continued for hours, with the family taking turns inflicting pain while discussing their plans for both women. Eliza learned that her scheduled execution had been moved up as punishment for her resistance, but not before they extracted full entertainment value from her suffering. When they finally returned her to the main chamber, Eliza was barely conscious and utterly broken in body if not in spirit. The bloodied rock remained where it had fallen, a mocking reminder of how close she had come to freedom and how completely she had failed. Ruth was dumped beside her, barely recognizable beneath her injuries, but still alive. As the family settled down for the remainder of the night, she managed to whisper a few words that cut through Eliza's despair. "Still got the rope," she breathed through split lips. "Hidden where they can't find it. Next time we don't try to fight. Next time we run." The failed escape had taught them both that force would never overcome the family's advantages in strength and numbers. But it had also revealed something crucial. Despite their cruelty and power, the family was not infallible. They had not discovered all of Ruth's secrets, and they still underestimated what desperation could accomplish when guided by intelligence rather than courage alone. The carved wooden cross fit perfectly in Eliza's palm, its surface smooth from countless hours of secret shaping during the long nights following her failed escape. She had carved it with a splinter of bone taken from the family's collection, working by touch, alone in the darkness, while her captors slept. Each careful scrape of the improvised tool against the salvaged wood served as both prayer and defiance, a tangible reminder that her soul remained unconquered, despite the horrors surrounding her. The weeks following her brutal punishment had taught Eliza lessons that mere suffering could never impart. Physical pain was temporary, but psychological warfare required deeper understanding of her enemy's weaknesses and desires. She began to study the family dynamics with the analytical mind that had made her an effective teacher, identifying the fractures and tensions that could be exploited. Jeremiah's authority rested on his ability to interpret God's will for the family, but his theological knowledge was limited and largely fabricated. When Eliza began engaging him in biblical discussions, demonstrating superior understanding of Scripture, she could see doubt creeping into his eyes. Her education threatened the foundation of his power. "You know, Jeremiah," she said during one of his sermons. "The passage in Leviticus that you quoted yesterday actually refers to ritual purification, not consumption of human flesh." The original Hebrew makes that distinction quite clear. The patriarch's face darkened with uncertainty. "You trying to tell me I don't know God's word?" "Not at all. I'm simply sharing knowledge that might enhance your understanding. After all, wouldn't God want his chosen servant to have access to the most accurate interpretations of Scripture?" These conversations served multiple purposes. They established Eliza as intellectually valuable, making the family less likely to kill her immediately. They also introduced doubt about Jeremiah's infallibility, potentially weakening his control over the other family members. Most importantly, they demonstrated to Ruth that resistance could take forms other than physical violence. Moses presented a different opportunity for manipulation. His inability to speak meant that he often felt excluded from family discussions, and his obvious discomfort with certain aspects of their lifestyle suggested a conscience that had not been completely destroyed. Eliza began acknowledging him directly during conversations, treating him as an intelligent participant rather than a mute enforcer. "Moses seems to understand the practical challenges of maintaining your operation," she would say to Jeremiah. "His knowledge of the mountain trails must be invaluable for planning hunts." The giant man's eyes would light up with surprise and gratitude at being recognized as more than just muscle. Gradually, he began to seek her approval for his contributions to family activities, creating a relationship that bypassed his father's authority. Caleb proved more difficult to influence, but Eliza noticed his fascination with the outside world during his recruitment missions. He asked detailed questions about life in cities, about new inventions, and social changes that had occurred since the family's isolation began. She fed this curiosity carefully, painting pictures of a world where his intelligence and skills could be valued rather than merely tolerated. "You have natural ability as an actor and storyteller," she told him, after he described one of his impersonations. "In the theater companies of St. Louis or Kansas City, such talents could make you wealthy and famous." The seed of possibility, once planted, began to grow in ways that Jeremiah couldn't control or even detect. Caleb started asking more questions about the outside world, about opportunities that might exist for someone with his particular skills. Ruth observed these psychological campaigns with growing understanding and hope. She began contributing her own insights about family vulnerabilities, sharing observations gleaned from years of careful watching. "Father fears losing control more than anything," she whispered during one of their secret conversations. When Mother tried to escape, his rage wasn't about losing her, it was about being defied. His whole identity depends on being the unquestioned leader. Together, they developed a more sophisticated strategy than their previous crude escape attempt. Instead of trying to overpower the family, they would encourage its disintegration from within. Each member would be given reasons to question their absolute loyalty to Jeremiah, and their commitment to the family's practices. The wooden cross became Eliza's anchor during this dangerous game of psychological manipulation. When doubt crept in about the morality of her tactics, when fear threatened to overwhelm her determination, she would run her thumb across its rough surface and remember that even in the depths of evil, faith could provide strength for resistance. "We're not trying to save them," she reminded Ruth during one of their planning sessions. "We're simply using their own weaknesses against them. Sometimes survival requires tactics that would be wrong under normal circumstances." Ruth nodded, understanding that their situation had moved far beyond normal moral considerations. They were fighting for their lives and their souls against enemies who had abandoned all human decency. In such a war, psychological weapons were not only justified, but necessary. Ruth's mother's wedding ring felt impossibly delicate in Eliza's palm, its thin gold band worn smooth by decades of wear and worry. The inscription inside was barely legible but still readable. "Forever yours, Samuel, 1889. It represented the last connection to civilized humanity within the family structure, a reminder that Ruth's mother had once been someone's beloved bride before becoming a victim of the family's evil. "She gave this to me the night before she died," Ruth whispered as she placed the ring in Eliza's hands. "Made me promise to give it to someone who might escape, someone who could tell the world that she tried to stay human, even in this place." The decision to help Eliza escape had torn Ruth apart for weeks. Despite everything she had endured, this cave system was the only home she had ever known, and these monsters were the only family she could remember. Leaving meant abandoning any hope of ever finding redemption for her father and brothers, accepting that they were beyond salvation. But Ruth's discovery of the family's plans for their upcoming harvest feast had forced her hand. Eliza's execution had been scheduled for November 1st, All Saints' Day, as the centerpiece of a celebration that would include other captives taken by family members scattered throughout the mountains. The feast would mark Eliza's transformation from person to meat. But it would also serve another purpose, the corruption of Ruth herself. Fathers decided it's time for me to participate fully in the family traditions, Ruth explained, her voice hollow with despair. "He wants me to help prepare your body, to take part in the consumption. Says it's the only way to ensure my loyalty and complete my transformation into a proper family member." Jeremiah had grown suspicious of Ruth's continued reluctance to embrace their cannibalistic practices. Her pretense of simple-mindedness had protected her thus far, but her father was beginning to question whether her mental deficiency was genuine or calculated resistance. The upcoming feast would serve as a test: participate fully or join the victims. "I won't do it," Ruth said with quiet determination. "I've watched them destroy so many people, but I won't let them destroy what's left of my soul. If helping you escape means I die, at least I'll die as myself." The plan they developed was more sophisticated than their previous attempt, incorporating everything they had learned about the family's routines and psychology. Instead of trying to overcome their captors through force, they would use the family's own preparations against them. The harvest feast required extensive advance planning. Additional family members would arrive from throughout the region, bringing their own captives and expecting elaborate hospitality. Jeremiah was already making preparations, cleaning the ceremonial chambers, organizing the ritual implements, and coordinating with his scattered relatives about timing and logistics. These preparations created opportunities that had not existed before. The main cave would be crowded with visitors, unfamiliar with its layout. The family's attention would be focused on hosting duties rather than guard responsibilities. Most importantly, the chaos of preparation would provide cover for unusual activities that might otherwise seem suspicious. Ruth had spent years memorizing every passage and chamber in the cave system, knowledge that would prove invaluable during their escape. But more than geographic familiarity, she possessed intimate understanding of each family, members' psychology and the leverage, points that could be used to manipulate their behavior. "Moses will be responsible for maintaining the fire during the feast," she explained. "It's a position of honor that he takes very seriously. If the fire starts to die during the ceremony, he'll leave his post to gather more wood rather than interrupt the ritual to ask for help." Caleb's role would involve greeting arriving family members and ensuring they understood the ceremony's significance. His pride in being trusted with such responsibilities could be exploited by creating situations that demanded his immediate attention at crucial moments. Even Jeremiah's ego could be turned against him. As the host and spiritual leader of the feast, he would be expected to deliver lengthy sermons explaining the theological significance of their practices. His love of hearing his own voice could provide extended periods when his attention was focused entirely on performance rather than security. The ceremony follows a specific pattern that hasn't changed in years, Ruth continued. "I know exactly when each family member will be occupied with their duties, when the guards will be distracted, when the escape routes will be clear. But the plan's success depended on Ruth's willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. She would have to remain behind to maintain the deception, to prevent immediate pursuit by ensuring the family didn't realize their captive had escaped until it was too late to track her effectively. Promise me you'll remember that not everyone in this family chose to become a monster, Ruth said as she closed Eliza's fingers around the wedding ring. Promise you'll tell people that some of us fought against the evil, even when fighting meant losing everything we had left. The lantern from the cabin cast dancing shadows against the cave walls as Ruth carefully positioned it behind a pile of dried brush and kindling. The flame would serve as both signal and weapon, creating the diversion that would allow Eliza to escape while simultaneously destroying the family's sanctuary. Everything they had planned for weeks was about to unfold in a cascade of fire, chaos, and desperate flight. The harvest feast had begun at sunset with the arrival of 7 family members from across the mountain region. Each brought their own captives, a merchant from Arkansas, 2 children taken from a homestead near the Tennessee border, an elderly preacher who had made the mistake of traveling alone through isolated valleys. The cave system buzzed with activity as relatives who saw each other only during these ceremonial gatherings renewed their bonds through shared depravity. Jeremiah presided over the gathering with obvious pride, his status as patriarch enhanced by the elaborate preparations and the quality of victims he had assembled. Eliza had been displayed like a prize throughout the evening, her education and refinement making her a particularly valuable offering to whatever dark god the family claimed to serve. Brothers and sisters in the Lord's work, Jeremiah announced as the ceremony reached its climactic phase, tonight we celebrate another year of faithful service to the Almighty's plan. The weak shall nourish the strong, the foolish shall feed the wise, and we shall grow in power through their sacrifice. Ruth moved through the gathering with the careful invisibility she had perfected over years of survival. To the visiting family members, she appeared to be a simple-minded daughter, helping with serving duties. None of them suspected that she was systematically weakening the rope bonds of selected captives, creating opportunities for chaos when the moment was right. The plan required precise timing and absolute commitment from both women. Ruth had spent hours explaining the cave system's layout to Eliza, tracing escape routes through passages that led to hidden exits miles from the main chambers. But memorizing the path was only part of the challenge. Eliza would have to navigate in complete darkness while injured and disoriented. As Jeremiah's sermon reached its peak, Ruth caught Eliza's eye across the crowded chamber and nodded almost imperceptibly. The moment had arrived. Ruth moved toward the lantern while Eliza began working the loosened knots that secured her bonds. The first sign of trouble came when Moses noticed smoke beginning to fill the chamber. The big man looked around in confusion, then spotted flames beginning to spread through the carefully arranged kindling. He roared in alarm, pointing toward the growing fire, while other family members turned to see what had caused his distress. In the chaos that followed, Ruth's planning proved its worth. The loosened captives began breaking free simultaneously, their panic adding to the confusion as they scattered in different directions. Family members rushed to contain both the fire and the escaping prisoners, shouting contradictory orders and getting in each other's way. Eliza slipped her bonds and crawled toward the passage Ruth had indicated, fighting through smoke and darkness while the sounds of violence erupted behind her. She could hear Ruth screaming, whether from pain or as part of the deception, she couldn't tell. The urge to turn back, to help the young woman who was sacrificing everything for her escape, nearly overwhelmed her survival instincts, but Ruth's final words echoed in her memory. "Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Don't let my sacrifice be meaningless." Eliza forced herself forward into the narrow passage, feeling her way along walls slick with moisture and decades of accumulated grime. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit were already beginning. Jeremiah's voice rose above the chaos, organizing his family members and demanding explanations for how their most valuable captive had escaped. The patriarch's rage was terrible to hear, promising consequences that made Eliza's previous torture seem mild by comparison. The passage twisted and branched in ways that tested her memory of Ruth's instructions. Left at the first junction, straight through the chamber with the underground stream, right where the ceiling dropped so low she had to crawl. Each decision carried the weight of life or death. Choose wrong, and she would wander in darkness until exhaustion or her pursuers claimed her. Water began seeping through the cave walls as she climbed toward what Ruth had promised was freedom. The sound of the underground spring grew louder, masking the noise of her passage, but also preventing her from hearing whether the family had discovered her escape route. As she pulled herself through the final narrow opening, Eliza felt cool mountain air against her face and saw stars visible through the cave mouth ahead. Ruth's sacrifice had bought her freedom, but at a cost that would haunt her forever. Somewhere behind her in the burning darkness, a young woman who had never known kindness was paying the ultimate price for choosing humanity over survival. Eliza's torn skirt fluttered from the branch where she had deliberately snagged it, creating a false trail that led away from her actual path through the treacherous mountain terrain. The fabric would suggest she had fled eastward toward the main valley roads, while she actually climbed higher into the most inhospitable ridges where pursuit would be, difficult and dangerous even for the family members who knew these mountains intimately. 3 days had passed since her escape from the burning cave. 3 days of constant movement, broken only by brief periods of rest when exhaustion threatened to overcome her entirely. She had managed perhaps 6 hours of sleep total, snatched in hidden crevices and abandoned animal dens while listening constantly for sounds of pursuit that never seemed far behind. The family's hunting skills had proven formidable even with the head start Ruth's sacrifice had provided. By dawn of the first day, Eliza could hear their voices echoing across the valleys below. Coordinated search patterns that demonstrated years of experience tracking fleeing prey through this unforgiving landscape. Their knowledge of every trail, every water source, every possible shelter gave them advantages that her desperation alone could not overcome. But Eliza possessed assets her pursuers couldn't account for. Intelligence sharpened by terror, determination fueled by moral outrage, and most importantly, the detailed knowledge of their methods and psychology that weeks of captivity had provided. She knew how they thought, how they hunted, and most crucially, how their arrogance might be turned against them. The false trail represented just one element of a strategy that combined everything Ruth had taught her about the mountain terrain with her own analytical approach to problem-solving. Each torn piece of fabric was placed to suggest hasty flight, while actually leading her pursuers away from safe paths toward areas where the terrain itself would slow their progress. Water was her most pressing concern. The October weather had been dry, and the streams Ruth had described were running lower than normal. Eliza had located 2 reliable springs, but reaching them required dangerous climbs that left her exposed to observation from the valleys below. She had learned to move only during the brief periods around dawn and dusk when mist provided concealment. Food was equally challenging. Her captivity had weakened her considerably, and the physical demands of climbing through rocky terrain while carrying minimal supplies quickly depleted her remaining strength. She found edible roots and berries that her childhood in rural Missouri had taught her to recognize, but the calories were insufficient to sustain her current pace of movement. On the second night, while sheltering in a cave barely large enough for her body, Eliza heard voices that froze her blood. Caleb and another family member were discussing their search strategy less than 50 yards from her hiding place, their words carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "She's got more sense than most," Caleb was saying. "Left false trails, stayed off the main paths, avoided the water sources we'd expect her to use. Father's starting to think she might actually make it to the valley." "Don't matter if she does," replied a voice Eliza didn't recognize. "Ain't nobody down there gonna believe her stories about us. Mountain folk keep their own counsel, and outsiders got a way of disappearing when they make too much noise about things that ain't their business." The conversation revealed that her escape was only the beginning of her challenges. Even if she reached civilization, the family's confidence about avoiding consequences suggested they had methods for dealing with survivors who might threaten their operations. But it also revealed something else. They were genuinely concerned about her escape, which meant Ruth's sacrifice had accomplished more than simply providing a distraction. The family's entire operation depended on maintaining secrecy, and a witness who could provide detailed information about their activities posed a threat they couldn't ignore. By the third day, Eliza's strategy began showing results. The sounds of pursuit became more distant and disorganized as her false trails led the family members into difficult terrain that slowed their progress. Her own path had taken her higher into the mountains than they probably expected, following ridgelines that provided long-distance visibility while avoiding the valleys where they concentrated their search efforts. The most dangerous moment came when Moses appeared on a parallel ridge, his massive frame unmistakable even at distance. The mute giant had somehow anticipated her route and positioned himself to intercept her descent toward the main trail system. For several hours, they engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocky outcroppings, with Eliza using every piece of cover to avoid being spotted while gradually working her way around his position. As the sun set on her third day of flight, Eliza could see lights in the valley below, the first signs of civilization she had glimpsed since her capture. But between her position and safety lay the most dangerous part of her journey, the final descent, where she would be most vulnerable to capture by pursuers who knew they were running out of time to silence her permanently. Jeremiah's hunting knife felt heavy in Eliza's trembling hands, its bone handle warm with the patriarch's blood and her own transformation from victim to survivor. The blade had been his grandfather's, carried through decades of murder and cannibalism, but now it belonged to her, trophy and tool alike, from the final confrontation that had ended the family's reign of terror in these cursed mountains. The battle had begun at dawn on the fourth day of her flight, when Jeremiah cornered her in a narrow ravine just 2 miles from the valley road. He had come alone, leaving his remaining sons to search other areas, confident that his personal intervention would end the embarrassment of her escape. His arrogance had become her opportunity. "End of the trail, Miss Teacher," he had said, emerging from the rocks above with the patient satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "Been quite a chase you've led us, but every hunt comes to its conclusion." Eliza faced him across 20 feet of rocky ground, her back against the ravine wall, and no visible escape route available. 3 days of constant flight had pushed her body beyond its limits, but had also stripped away everything except the essential core of her will to survive. The refined schoolteacher who had entered these mountains no longer existed. "I know what you're thinking," Jeremiah continued, beginning his slow descent toward her position. "Wondering if you can fight me, if you got the strength left to resist what's coming. Truth is, you've been dead since the moment you set foot in our territory. Just took you a while to understand it." But Jeremiah had made a critical error in his assessment of what Eliza had become during her weeks of captivity and days of desperate flight. The woman who stood before him bore little resemblance to the gentle educator who had once believed that human nature was essentially good. She had seen evil in its purest form, had been forced to embrace tactics that would have horrified her former self, and had learned that survival sometimes required becoming the very thing you feared. When he lunged forward with the confidence of someone who had overpowered dozens of victims, Eliza was ready. Instead of retreating or attempting to flee, she stepped into his attack and drove the sharp rock she had concealed in her right hand directly into his temple. The blow staggered him but didn't drop him. and suddenly they were locked in a struggle that would determine not just her fate, but the future of every potential victim who might wander into these mountains. Jeremiah was larger and stronger, but age and decades of easy kills had made him overconfident. Eliza fought with the desperate fury of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. When he wrapped his hands around her throat, she clawed at his eyes with nails she had deliberately sharpened on stone. When he tried to drag her to the ground, she used his momentum to drive both of them against the ravine wall. The knife had fallen from his belt during their struggle, and both combatants saw it at the same moment. The race to reach the weapon became a separate battle within their larger conflict, each trying to prevent the other from gaining the advantage that would end the fight permanently. Eliza reached it first, her smaller size allowing her to squeeze through a gap in the rocks that Jeremiah couldn't navigate quickly. But gaining possession of the blade was only the beginning. She still had to use it effectively against an opponent who had spent a lifetime inflicting violence on others. The patriarch's eyes showed genuine fear for the first time as he realized his weapon was now in her hands. "You ain't got it in you, Miss Teacher," he said, trying to back away while maintaining his psychological advantage. "Your civilized folk don't have the stomach for what needs doing." "You're right," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "The woman you captured would never have had the stomach for this. But you killed her weeks ago, and what's left?" The final exchange lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Jeremiah rushed forward, gambling that her civilized nature would prevent her from using the blade effectively. Eliza proved him wrong, driving the knife upward between his ribs with surgical precision that found his heart on the first strike. As the patriarch collapsed, his eyes held something Eliza had never seen there before: surprise. He had spent so many years as the predator that he couldn't comprehend becoming prey, couldn't accept that his reign of terror had finally met something more determined than his own evil. Standing over his body with the bloodied knife in her hands, Eliza felt the transformation complete itself. She was no longer a victim or even a survivor. She had become something new, something forged in darkness but pointed toward. Like the sheriff's badge caught the afternoon sunlight as Sheriff William Morrison pinned it back to his vest after examining the bloodied knife that Eliza had carried. Out of the mountains, the star-shaped metal represented everything she had been fighting to reach: law, order, civilization, and the promise that evil could be brought to justice when brave people chose to stand against it. Sheriff Morrison was a weathered man in his 50s who had spent 3 decades keeping peace in communities that preferred to handle their own problems rather than involve outside authorities. But the story that Eliza told him, supported by physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, demanded action beyond anything he had previously encountered. "Miss Whitlock," he said, after she finished her account of the weeks in captivity and her escape from the cannibal family, "I've heard stories about strange doings in the high country for years. Travelers gone missing, reports of smoke where no honest homestead should be. But this is the first time anyone's come out of those mountains with proof of what's been happening up there." Eliza sat in the sheriff's office, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her appearance shocking even to people accustomed to hardship. 3 weeks of captivity, followed by 4 days of desperate flight, had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed. But there was something else in her bearing that commanded respect, the unmistakable presence of someone who had survived the unthinkable. The townspeople of Miller's Junction had initially greeted her arrival with skepticism that bordered on hostility. A lone woman stumbling out of the mountains with tales of cannibalism and mass murder seemed more likely to be suffering from exposure and delusion than providing accurate testimony about real crimes. But the physical evidence spoke louder than their doubts. Jeremiah's knife, with its distinctive bone handle and ritual markings, was recognized by several older residents as belonging to the Hutchins family that had disappeared into the mountains decades earlier. The items from her captivity, Ruth's mother's wedding ring, fragments of victims' clothing, The carved wooden cross she had made during her imprisonment provided corroboration that her story was grounded in horrific reality. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician, had examined Eliza upon her arrival and documented injuries consistent with prolonged torture and physical abuse. His medical report, written in careful professional language, described evidence of systematic cruelty that supported her account of the family's methods. The burns on her shoulder and arms showed deliberate patterning, Dr. Hayes explained to Sheriff Morrison. These weren't accidental injuries or the result of wilderness survival. Someone inflicted these wounds intentionally, probably with heated metal implements. Word of Eliza's escape spread quickly through the surrounding communities, bringing forward other witnesses who had lost family members or friends to unexplained disappearances in the mountain region. The wife of the railroad man from Springfield confirmed that her husband had been carrying the pocket watch found in the family's collection. Parents whose children had vanished while traveling through the area provided descriptions that matched items Eliza had seen in the cave. My boy Timothy was wearing a blue wool coat when he disappeared last spring, said Martha Fletcher, a woman whose grief had aged her beyond her 40 years. I had a torn pocket that I'd mended with brown thread. You say you saw such a coat among their belongings? Eliza nodded, remembering the careful organization of the family's trophy collection. They sorted clothing by type and size. Children's garments were kept separate from adult items. The accumulation of evidence forced even the most skeptical residents to accept that something monstrous had been operating in their region for years. The scope of the crimes suggested an organization far beyond what any individual could accomplish. Requiring multiple participants and systematic methods, Sheriff Morrison began organizing a large-scale expedition into the mountains, recruiting volunteers from throughout the region and requesting assistance from federal marshals who had jurisdiction over crimes that crossed state boundaries. The operation would require considerable manpower and resources, but the evidence demanded thorough investigation. We'll need at least 20 men to search those mountains properly, Morrison explained to the assembled volunteers, and we'll need to be prepared for what we might find up there. Based on Miss Whitlock's testimony, we're looking at multiple crime scenes and evidence of dozens of murders spanning several decades. The community's response demonstrated the power of truth to mobilize decent people against evil. Farmers left their harvest preparations, merchants closed their shops, and even elderly men who hadn't ridden horses in years volunteered to join the expedition. The horror of what had been happening in their mountains demanded a response that transcended individual concerns about safety or convenience. As the expedition prepared to depart, Eliza felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Justice was finally coming to the high ridges, but she knew that some of the family members had escaped the fire she and Ruth had set. The evil that had festered in those mountains for decades wouldn't be completely eliminated until every member of the clan was found and held accountable for their crimes. The official investigation report lay open on Sheriff Morrison's desk, its pages documenting horrors that challenged the investigators' ability to maintain professional objectivity. Federal Marshal James Bradley had insisted on thorough documentation of every crime scene, every piece of evidence, every detail that might be needed for future prosecutions. The report would serve as the definitive record of what law enforcement had discovered in the high ridges of the Missouri Ozarks. The expedition had located the family's cave system 3 days after departing Miller's Junction, guided by Eliza's detailed descriptions of landmarks and geographical features. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations based on her testimony. The fire Ruth had started during the escape had destroyed much of the main chamber, but the deeper passages remained intact, preserving evidence of crimes spanning nearly 50 years. The first burial site contained remains of at least 37 individuals, Marshal Bradley read from his preliminary notes. Victims ranging in age from approximately 6 years to 70 years, both male and female. showing evidence of systematic butchering and consumption. The methodical nature of the family's operations became clear as investigators mapped the cave system and catalogued its contents. Separate chambers had been dedicated to different aspects of their activities: storage areas for victims' belongings, preparation rooms for processing human remains, and ritual spaces where they conducted their twisted religious ceremonies. Dr. Hayes had accompanied the expedition to provide medical expertise in examining the human remains. His findings painted a picture of organized sadism that went far beyond simple cannibalism driven by hunger or desperation. Many of the victims show evidence of prolonged torture before death, he reported. Systematic injuries that would have caused severe pain but wouldn't have been immediately fatal. They were keeping people alive and suffering for extended periods. The collection of personal effects found in the caves told stories of lives cut short across multiple states and decades. Railroad watches from Kansas City, jewelry from St. Louis, clothing that had belonged to families traveling through the region on legitimate business. Each item represented someone who had trusted the wrong guide, accepted help from the wrong stranger, or simply had the misfortune to encounter the family's hunting operations. Most disturbing were the detailed records the family had maintained of their crimes. Jeremiah's grandfather had begun keeping a journal of their activities during the Civil War, and subsequent generations had continued the practice. The journals contained dates, victim descriptions, and notes about hunting methods that demonstrated how their operation had evolved over time. They treated it like a business, Marshall Bradley observed. Careful records, systematic methods, continuous improvement of their techniques. This wasn't random violence or crimes of opportunity. This was organized evil operating with long-term planning. The investigation revealed that the family's network extended far beyond the immediate clan that Eliza had encountered. They maintained contact with similar groups throughout the Ozark Mountain region, sharing information about potential victims and coordinating activities to avoid detection by authorities. Evidence found in the caves suggested that as many as 6 related families had participated in the broader network, each controlling different territories and using slightly different methods, but all sharing the same fundamental practices. The scope of the crimes implied that dozens of people had been involved in systematic murder and cannibalism over multiple generations. Public reaction to the investigation's findings was immediate and intense. Newspapers throughout Missouri and neighboring states carried detailed accounts of the discoveries, generating outrage that demanded swift justice for the surviving family members. The stories captured national attention, with reporters traveling from as far away as Chicago and New York to cover the investigation. "Cannibal Clan terrorized Ozarks for decades," read the headline in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. "Heroic teacher's escape exposes network of murder and human consumption." The media attention brought forward additional witnesses who had lost family members to unexplained disappearances in the region. Parents, spouses, and children who had spent years wondering about missing loved ones finally received answers. Though the truth was more horrible than they could have imagined, legal proceedings began immediately against Caleb and Moses, who had been captured during the expedition, along with 3 other family members found hiding in outlying camps. The evidence against them was overwhelming, but the prosecution faced challenges in determining appropriate charges for crimes that had no precedent in legal history. "How do you prosecute someone for systematic cannibalism?" asked District Attorney Robert Welsh. "Our legal system wasn't designed to handle crimes of this magnitude and depravity." The investigation also raised troubling questions about how such activities could have continued for so long without detection. The family's isolation in difficult terrain explained part of their success, but their network sophistication suggested they had received help, or at least willful ignorance from people who should have known better. Eliza found herself at the center of media, attention that she neither wanted nor felt prepared to handle. Her testimony would be crucial to the prosecution of the surviving family members. But the constant questions and scrutiny from reporters and curious citizens took a heavy toll on her recovery from the trauma. Eliza's final journal entry, written 23 years after her escape from the Missouri Ozarks, reflected the measured wisdom of someone who had spent decades integrating an experience that defied normal human understanding. The leather-bound book sat on her desk in the Denver schoolhouse, where she had spent the last 15 years of her teaching career, its pages chronicling not just the horror of her captivity, but the long journey toward healing and purpose that had followed. November 1st, 1935, she wrote in the careful script that had remained steady despite the passage of years. 23 years ago today, I was scheduled to die in a cannibal feast in the mountains of Missouri. Instead, I'm preparing lesson plans for 42 students who will never know how precious their ordinary lives truly are. The decades following her escape had brought changes that the young woman of 1912 could never have imagined. She had testified at the trials that sent Caleb and Moses to their deaths, her testimony helping to ensure that justice was served for at least some of the family's crimes. The legal proceedings had been difficult, forcing her to relive her captivity in excruciating detail. But they had also provided a sense of closure that many trauma survivors never achieve. Public fascination with her story had never completely faded. Journalists occasionally contacted her requesting interviews. Authors sought her cooperation for books about the case, and curious strangers sometimes appeared at her school hoping to meet the woman who had survived the Ozark cannibals. She had learned to politely decline most such requests, preferring to let her actions speak louder than endless retellings of past horrors. Her work with traumatized children had become her life's mission after the ordeal in the mountains. She had developed innovative teaching methods for students who had experienced violence, abandonment, or other forms of severe trauma. Her classroom became a refuge where damaged young souls could begin to heal while receiving the education that would give them hope for better futures. I have learned that survival is not the end of the story, she wrote. It is merely the beginning of the obligation to transform suffering into service, to use knowledge gained in darkness to create light for others. The scars from her captivity remained visible both physically and emotionally. The burn marks on her arms served as permanent reminders of what human beings were capable of inflicting on each other. But she had refused to let those scars define her identity or limit her capacity for hope. Her marriage to Dr. Samuel Hayes had surprised many people who expected her to remain forever marked by her experience with evil. But Samuel had understood that healing required connection rather than isolation, that love could coexist with trauma without diminishing either. Their partnership had produced 2 children who grew up knowing their mother's story, but defined by their own aspirations rather than her past. The community of Cedar Ridge had never forgotten her sacrifice, though the details had become legend rather than precise history. Every year on November 1st, the townspeople held a memorial service for the victims of the cannibal family, with Eliza serving as the living link between memory and hope. Ruth's memory remained central to how Eliza understood her survival and her obligations to the future. The young woman who had sacrificed everything to ensure her escape had become more than a memory. She had become a guiding principle that influenced every major decision Eliza made. Ruth believed that some people are worth saving, even when salvation seems impossible, she wrote. She saw humanity in me when I could no longer see it in myself, and she gave her life to preserve something larger than either of us understood at the time. The questions that had haunted the early years of her recovery had gradually resolved into acceptance of mystery. She would never fully understand why she had been chosen to survive when so many others had perished. She would never completely comprehend how ordinary people could transform into monsters. or how evil could flourish for so long in proximity to good, but she had learned that understanding was less important than responding appropriately to the knowledge that had been purchased with others' blood. Her life after the mountains had been dedicated to the principle that survivors have obligations to the dead, to the living, and to the future. As she closed the journal and prepared for another day of teaching, Eliza reflected on the transformation that had begun in a cave filled with horror and continued in classrooms filled with possibility. The young teacher who had ventured into the Missouri Ozarks in 1912 had been consumed by the experience, but what emerged had been tempered into something stronger and more purposeful than what had been lost. The question that had echoed through those hills: did she really escape? Or did something wearing her face walk out of those woods? Had finally been answered through decades of service to others. She had escaped, but she had also carried something precious out of the darkness, the knowledge that even in the presence of absolute evil, human dignity could endure.